The first time Birdie Ellsworth fired a rifle, she was 17 years old and standing in the doorway of a sod house that smelled like frozen earth and grief. And the second time she fired one, she was 24 and standing in the doorway of a life she had not expected to want. The town of Caldera Springs sat in the low basin of the Texas Panhandle like a coin dropped carelessly into a dry riverbed, forgotten by the hand that tossed it, baking under a sun that had no mercy for the proud or the desperate. It was 1882, and the cattle drives had thinned some since the railroads pushed their iron fingers deeper into the territory. But the town still breathed with the restless energy of men who had not quite decided whether to stay or go. There was a general store run by a widow named Marta Foss, a telegraph office with a cracked window that no one had replaced in 2 years, a saloon called the Red Drum that smelled of sawdust and regret, and a livery stable at the far end of the main road where the ground turned soft and brown near the well. Birdie had come to Caldera Springs 3 years prior with her father, Clement Ellsworth, who had believed with the absolute conviction of a man who has never been wrong in his own estimation that the land west of the Cimarron would make them wealthy. Clement had been wrong. He had died wrong, too, taken by a fever in the autumn of 1880, leaving Birdie with a half-built homestead, 40 acres of hardpan, 2 horses, a milk cow named Sadie, and a silence so complete it had weight to it. Birdie did not grieve loudly. That was the thing people in Caldera Springs said about her in the way people say things that are meant to be admirable but carry an undercurrent of unease. They said she was steady. They said she was capable. Old Marta Foss said she had the eyes of a woman who had swallowed something difficult and kept right on walking, and that was perhaps the most accurate description anyone offered. What they did not know, because Birdie had never told anyone, was that she had not cried since the long winter of 1880 and 1881, when the blizzards had come in sheets, and the cold had been so absolute that the world had seemed to stop existing beyond the walls of whatever shelter a person could find. That winter had taken her father first with fever, and then had taken 2 of Clement's horses, and then had taken something inside Birdie herself, some soft and yielding part of her that she had not been able to locate since. She had stood over her father's grave in frozen ground and felt the tears press against the backs of her eyes and refuse to fall, and they had never fallen after that, not in front of anyone, not when the homestead's roof partially collapsed in the spring, not when the bank in Amarillo sent a man to remind her about the debt her father had left, not when the loneliness came at night like a second weather system settling over the plains. She had decided that this was simply who she was now, a woman made of practical things, a woman who could mend fence and negotiate with supply merchants and drive a wagon 40 miles without complaint, a woman who did not need the softness of tears because softness was a luxury the Panhandle did not afford. Then Graham Dalton rode into Caldera Springs on a Thursday morning in early April of 1882, and nothing about him announced that he would be the person to undo all of that careful architecture. He came in on a gray horse named Cobalt, which Birdie would learn later was a name the horse had earned not for his color, but for his temperament, which was stubborn and particular and occasionally alarming. Graham himself was 28 years old, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who have done real physical work for real years, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at his collar because it had gone too long between cuttings, and a jaw that held a few days' worth of beard the color of river sand. He had brown eyes that were quiet in the way a deep well is quiet still on the surface, but suggesting considerable depth beneath. He had come from Colorado, he told Hector Prine at the livery stable, where he had been working cattle ranches for the better part of 5 years. He was looking to put down something more permanent. He had some money saved. He had heard there was land available in the basin. Hector Prine, who talked to everyone and about everyone, relayed this information to the general store the following morning, which was how Birdie came to know Graham Dalton existed before she had ever exchanged a word with him. She heard it and felt nothing in particular except the mild, practical thought that new settlers were good for the town's economy. And then she went back to examining the quality of the flour she was purchasing, because Marta Foss had recently switched suppliers and the last batch had been gritty in a way that made for poor biscuits. The actual meeting happened 4 days later, on a Monday, in the street outside the telegraph office. Birdie was coming out with a folded paper in her hand, a response to a letter she had sent to her cousin in Kansas about a matter regarding the sale of some of her father's remaining surveying equipment, and she was reading it while walking, which was a habit she had developed and which several people had advised her against for safety reasons, and which she had continued doing because she considered herself capable of walking and reading simultaneously. She was wrong on this particular Monday, because the step down from the telegraph office boardwalk was slightly higher than she had remembered, and she misjudged it, and she stumbled forward with enough momentum that catching herself would have been difficult. Graham Dalton was walking past at that exact moment, and he caught her, one hand catching her elbow and the other bracing her forearm, and he steadied her so efficiently that she was upright again before she had fully processed what had happened. "Steady," he said, and then appeared to realize that was perhaps not the most expansive response to a near fall, and added, "Are you all right?" "I am perfectly fine," Birdie said, with the kind of crisp certainty that was her default register when she felt embarrassed, "and I'm entirely aware that I should not read while walking." "I wasn't going to say that," Graham said. "Most people do. Most people aren't carrying a letter that looks like it required some waiting for." Birdie looked at him then, properly, the way she looked at things she was assessing. He was looking at the paper in her hand with a mildly curious expression and absolutely no condescension, which was unusual enough to register. "My cousin in Kansas," she said, without knowing exactly why she was volunteering this. "It is not bad news." "I'm glad to hear it," he said, and he said it like he meant it, simply, without decoration. She introduced herself. He introduced himself. They stood in the April street with the dust moving between them and the sun already warm enough to mean business, and the conversation lasted perhaps 4 more minutes before each of them had somewhere else to be, and when Birdie walked back to where her wagon was hitched, she found herself thinking that he had steady hands and that she had not noticed a man's hands in some time. She did not make anything of this. She was practical. The land Graham eventually purchased was the Hennessy parcel, 35 acres, that abutted the eastern edge of the basin. And it was not beautiful land, and it was not easy land, but it was honest land in the way that difficult things are honest. And he set about building on it with the focused patience of a man who had learned to think in seasons. He put up a rough cabin first, working with lumber he hauled from the mill in Dalhart. And then he turned his attention to the fencing and the well and the small outbuildings that were the infrastructure of a working place. Birdie's homestead was not directly adjacent to his, but it was not far either, and in a place as spread out as the Panhandle, not far meant that they occupied a kind of shared geography. They crossed paths at Marta's store with a frequency that was explained entirely by the fact that Marta's store was the only store, and they crossed paths at the well that served the southeast quarter of the basin, and they crossed paths occasionally on the road that ran between their 2 properties and the town. These crossings were polite, they were pleasant. Birdie told herself they were ordinary, but she noticed things. She noticed that Graham Dalton did not waste words, which she respected, because words were frequently wasted in her experience. She noticed that he had a way of listening that was complete, as if the person speaking had his full attention and not merely the portion of it left over from his own thoughts. She noticed that he treated his horse with a consistency of kindness that was telling, because she had always believed that a person's character was most legible in how they treated an animal that could not explain its feelings. She noticed that he had a laugh that surprised her the first time she heard it, because it was warmer and more genuine than she had expected from someone so generally quiet. And she noticed that this surprised her. And then she noticed that she was spending time noticing things about him, and she found this both interesting and inconvenient. The spring turned warm and then turned hot, as Texas springs are inclined to do without apology, and the town of Caldera Springs ran at its usual rhythm of commerce and gossip, and the small dramas of people living in close proximity to each other's struggles. There was a man named Holt Digby who owned a substantial portion of the grazing land north of town, and who had spent the better part of 2 years attempting to purchase Birdie's 40 acres at a price that was politely described as low and more accurately described as insulting. Holt Digby was not a villain in the theatrical sense. He was simply a man who believed that acquisition was the primary virtue, and who treated the land of smaller homesteaders as an eventual inevitability rather than a legitimate choice. And he had been patient about it in the way of someone who has the luxury of time. He visited Birdie in early May with a new offer, which was marginally higher than the previous one and still not adequate, and Birdie turned it down with the same level politeness she always offered, and Holt Digby rode away with the particular expression of a man who believes that patience will eventually win him what refusal will not deliver. Birdie had told no one about these repeated offers, because she did not want advice and she did not want sympathy, and she had made her decision clearly enough that she saw no reason to rehearse it aloud. She would not sell the 40 acres. Her father had broken himself for those 40 acres, had loved them with the specific passion of a man who had grown up with nothing, and who believed that land was the answer to a question that had followed him his whole life. Clement Ellsworth had been wrong about many things, but he had not been wrong about the love of the land itself, and Birdie had inherited this if she had inherited nothing else from him, and she would hold it. She told Graham about the offer in June, not because she had planned to, but because they were standing at the well together and Holt Digby Road passed on the road above them, and Graham had asked a neutral question about whether she knew the man, and the truth came out in the practical, undramatic way that truths sometimes do when a person is not braced for the telling of them. "He has been making offers for 2 years," she said, watching Digby's horse crest the small rise and disappear. "They get slightly better each time. They are still not what the land is worth." "What are you going to do?" Graham asked. "What I have been doing, decline." "You're certain?" "I have never been more certain of anything," she said, and there was something in her voice when she said it that was not just stubbornness but love, the specific love for a thing that has cost a great deal, and Graham heard it because he was the kind of man who listened for the notes underneath the notes. "Then that's the right answer," he said simply. She looked at him. "You don't have an opinion about whether it's practical." "It's your land," he said. "Practical is your calculation to make." She was quiet for a moment, and something in the quality of the silence between them shifted very slightly, like a door that had been resting against its frame beginning to ease open. "My father would have liked that answer," she said. "What was he like?" And she told him, standing at the well in the June heat with the water in the bucket going warm. She told him about Clement Ellsworth and his maps and his absolute conviction and his talent for choosing the wrong moment to be right about something and his love of the land and his terrible coffee and the way he had hummed without knowing he was doing it. She talked for longer than she had planned to. Graham leaned against the well frame and listened and asked questions that were the right questions, the ones that opened rooms rather than closing them, and by the time she had finished, the sun had moved a considerable distance across the sky. "I have not talked about him that much at once in a long time," she said, slightly surprised by this. "He sounds like a man worth talking about," Graham said. She picked up her bucket. "I should get back." "I'll walk the road with you," he said. "I'm going that direction anyway." He probably wasn't, but she didn't point this out, and they walked the dusty road together with the heat rising off the ground and the flat Texas sky above them enormous and pale and old. And Birdie Ellsworth felt something she hadn't felt in some time, a cautious, tentative warmth that she was not yet ready to name. The summer of 1882 in the Texas Panhandle was hard in the way that summer in that country was often hard, with heat that bent the light and dried the grass to the color of old paper and tested the wells and the patience of everything that lived there. But it was also a summer that had a particular quality of aliveness to it, at least for Birdie, a quality she attributed to various practical causes, and carefully declined to attribute to the fact that Graham Dalton was becoming a presence in her days in the way that a person becomes a presence, not through dramatic gesture, but through the accumulated weight of ordinary moments. He helped her repair a section of fence in late June when she was short-handed, not because she had asked, but because he had been riding past and seen the problem and stopped. She brought him a pot of bean stew in return, because that was how the exchange worked out here, labor and food and the small currencies of mutual survival, and he ate it on his porch steps and said it was the best thing he had eaten in 3 months, which she suspected was an exaggeration, but accepted with more pleasure than she would have expected. In July, the Red Drum Saloon had a Saturday night when a trio of traveling musicians came through, and the town turned out in the way that small towns turn out for entertainment, with an enthusiasm that would have seemed excessive anywhere there was more of it to be had. Birdie went because Marta Foss had asked her to, and because she liked music, and because 40 acres of hardpan was no substitute for human company even when she pretended it was. Graham was there, near the edge of the gathered crowd, with a cup of cider because he was not a heavy drinking man, and when the fiddle player struck up a reel and people began to move, he looked at her across the space between them with an expression that was a question. She danced with him. She had not danced with anyone since before the long winter, and she had forgotten that her body knew how to do it, how to follow and respond and trust the guiding pressure of a hand. And Graham danced with the same quality he brought to everything, steady and attentive and not showing off, and she found herself laughing at something he said near the end of the second song, a real laugh, the kind that came up from somewhere unexpected. He was looking at her when she laughed, and what was in his eyes when he looked at her was something she did not examine closely for another week, but when she did, she knew it for what it was. She rode home that night under a sky so full of stars it seemed impractical, and she sat on her porch for a long while after putting up her horse, looking at the dark shape of the land she loved, and she thought about Graham Dalton's hands on her waist when they danced and his voice when he said things that were simple and true, and she thought about how she had told him about her father and how that had felt like setting down a weight she had been carrying through all her rooms. And she thought about the long winter and the part of herself she had believed lost. She did not think it was found yet, but she thought perhaps she had begun to locate its direction. August came with its full merciless heat, and with it came complications. The complication arrived in the form of a man named Cass Whitfield who rode into Caldera Springs with 2 other men on a Wednesday and took rooms at the boarding house and spent 2 days moving around town, with the particular manner of men conducting an assessment. Whitfield worked for a land consolidation company out of Fort Worth called the Meridian Land Group, and what the Meridian Land Group did was identify parcels that had tax liabilities or disputed titles or weaknesses of any kind, and apply pressure to those weaknesses until the land became available. Birdie had a tax liability. She had known about it for some time. It was not insurmountable, but it was not nothing either, a debt of $63 that had accumulated across 2 years of lean harvests and the specific financial pressure of maintaining a homestead alone, and she had been managing it the way she managed most difficulties, one careful step at a time. Whitfield found out about the liability through the county records, which were public, and he came to see her on a Thursday morning with a smile that did not reach his eyes and a briefcase that contained papers she did not like the look of. He told her that Meridian Land Group was prepared to purchase the tax debt, and if she could not redeem it within 30 days, proceed to acquisition of the property under Texas law. He told her this in the smooth, pleasant voice of a man who has delivered this speech many times and has decided that pleasantness is the most efficient delivery mechanism for bad news. Birdie stood in the doorway of her house and listened to him without expression, and she felt the old cold steadiness settle over her like armor, and when he was finished she said, "I will have the $63 within 30 days. In the same tone, she might have said she would be at the market on Friday. Whitfield left. Birdie closed the door, stood in the center of her single front room, and calculated. She did not have $63. She had 19, and some additional value in the surveying equipment she had been slow to sell, and she had options, but none of them were comfortable, and some of them involved swallowing a pride that she had sustained herself on for 3 years. She did not sleep well that night. She also did not tell Graham about it, because accepting his help with fence repair was one thing, and involving him in the financial emergency at the center of her life was another, and she was not ready to need someone like that, was not certain she knew how to need someone without it costing her something essential about herself. What she did do was go to Marta Foss the next morning and ask about the surveying equipment, because Marta had connections to a buyer in Amarillo she had mentioned some months back, and Marta was practical and discreet, and had earned Birdie's trust across 3 years of small kindnesses that had never been offered with condescension. Marta thought the equipment could fetch $35 from the buyer she knew. That left still $28 short. Birdie spent the weekend going over every option she had. She could sell one of the horses, but the horses were working animals and she needed them. She could take a loan from the bank in Dalhart, but the bank in Dalhart had already loaned more against Clement's original debt than was comfortable, and she was not certain she would qualify. She could take work at Marta's store, but Marta could not afford another wage, and both of them knew it. She could appeal to Holt Digby for an advance against the sale of some grazing rights on the south portion of the 40 acres, which would be the most practical option, and also the one that would put her in Digby's orbit in a way she liked least. She was sitting with these calculations on a Sunday afternoon at the table where she did her accounts, when she heard a horse outside and then Graham's voice calling her name in the way he had learned to call it, not a summons but more like a question, the way you might knock on a door by saying the name of the person inside. She went to the door. He was standing with Cobalt's reins in his hand, and he had something in the other hand that turned out to be a folded letter, and he looked at her face the way he often did with that complete attention, and he said, "Something's wrong." It was not a question. "I am fine," she said. "Birdie," he said, and there was something in the way he said her name that was different from his usual register, something with more weight to it, and she felt herself standing very still inside. "There is a financial matter," she said. "I am resolving it." He stood there. He didn't push, didn't press, didn't tell her to let him help the way people sometimes did with the urgent helpfulness that was more about their own discomfort with another person's difficulty than it was about the person having the difficulty. He simply stood there and waited, and somehow this was more effective than pushing would have been. She told him, all of it. The tax liability, the 30 days, Whitfield and his briefcase, Marta and the $35, the gap she still could not close, and Holt Digby waiting at the edge of it all like a patient, unhurried fact. When she finished, Graham was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I have the $28. "I am not asking for that," she said immediately. "I know you're not," he said. "I'm offering it." "Graham, let me finish," he said, with a calm firmness that was not interruption but was close to it. "This isn't charity, and it isn't a favor that puts you in debt to me in any way I intend to collect. I have been where you are. I have been in a place where the gap between what I had and what I needed was small enough to cross if someone extended a hand, and large enough to be the end of everything if they didn't. Someone helped me once. They wouldn't let me make it into anything more than it was. It was just one person helping another person keep what they'd earned." She looked at him for a long time. The August heat pressed around them both. Somewhere on the flat distance a hawk was making long, slow circles. It would need to be a proper arrangement, she said, a recorded loan with terms. However you want it, he said, I would pay interest. You would pay at whatever rate makes you comfortable and no more than that, he said. Why are you this way? She asked, and the question came out with less armor on it than she had intended, the bare edge of something genuine underneath. He looked at her steadily. Because you deserve to keep your land, he said. And because I would not be able to look at myself in a mirror if I stood by and watched you lose it when I had the means to help. The money was arranged the following morning, properly, with a written note of agreement that Birdie insisted on because her integrity would not allow anything else. And within a week she had sent the $63 to the county tax office and received the clearance documentation. And when Cass Whitfield's man came around again at the 25-day mark to inquire about progress, she handed him the clearance document with a politeness so complete it contained no warmth at all. Whitfield and his men left town 2 days later. Holt Digby, who had presumably been informed of this resolution through whatever channels men like Whitfield used, did not come by with another offer that month, which Birdie took as a tactical retreat rather than a concession, and she was probably right. She began repaying Graham's loan immediately, in monthly portions that she made certain never to miss, because the agreement was the agreement, and she was not a woman who let obligations slide. He accepted the payments without comment, and without the particular expression some people wear when accepting repayment that communicates a wish that you wouldn't bother, because he understood that the repayment was as important to her as the loan. But something had shifted between them in the telling of it, in her allowing herself to be seen in that vulnerable position and him responding as he had, without diminishing her or making the help about his own virtue, and the shift was irreversible in the way that most real shifts are. They began spending more deliberate time together after that. Not hidden, not dramatic, just the natural progression of two people who had been orbiting the same center and had gradually closed the distance. He would ride over some evenings and sit on her porch with her while the sun went down, and they would talk about the land and the coming season and the town and the 1,000 small, specific subjects that accumulate between people who are paying attention to the same world. She would sometimes ride over to where he was working on the fence expansion on the north side of his property and bring water and stay for a while, and they would work in the comfortable silence of people who have discovered that they can be quiet together without it being awkward. He told her about Colorado, about the ranches he had worked and the country he had come through, about his family in New Mexico who he wrote to but saw rarely, a mother who was tough and funny and had opinions about everything, a younger brother named Ellis who was learning to be a blacksmith. He told her about why he had come to the Panhandle, not just the practical reasons but the real reason, which was that he had wanted a place that was his own, fully and finally, without the borrowed quality of working someone else's land, and the Panhandle had called to him in a way he found difficult to articulate but had decided to trust. She understood this. She told him she understood it. And something in his expression, when she said it, told her that being understood on this particular point had been something he had not been certain he would find. In September, the heat broke and the first true cool moved across the plains from the north, and the air changed quality in the way it does in that country when summer releases its grip, going from something thick and pressing to something clean and wide and full of distance, and the change in the air seemed to correspond to a change in the quality of everything, a general loosening, a sense that the things held tight all summer could begin to breathe. Birdie was in her barn one morning in the first week of September, dealing with a piece of harness that had developed a weakness in the stitching, when she heard Cobalt's particular sound outside, which she had learned to identify, and then Graham's boots on the barn floor, and she looked up. He was looking at her in a way he had not quite looked at her before, or perhaps in a way he had been looking at her for some time, and she was only now seeing it fully, without the various practical purposes she had been using as deflection. It was a look of such plain and unguarded wanting that it stopped her where she was. "Birdie," he said. "Graham," she said back, and her voice was quieter than usual. "I have something I want to say to you," he said, "and I want to say it plainly because I don't know any other way to say it, and I don't think you would want me to dress it up in anything that obscured it." "All right," she said, setting down the harness. "I have been in this town for 5 months," he said, "and in those 5 months I have come to know you in a way I have not known another person in a long time. I know how you think and how you work, and how you love the land you're on. I know that you are brave in a way that is very quiet and therefore easy to miss, unless you are paying attention. I know that you laugh from somewhere real when you actually laugh, and I know that you are careful about what you let people see of you, and I understand why that is." He paused. "I am not asking you for anything you are not ready to give. I am only telling you what is true. I think about you constantly. I would like to court you if you would allow it. If you wouldn't, I will accept that and still be your friend and still be glad that I know you." The barn was very quiet. A horse shifted. The morning light came through the planks in long, pale bars. Birdie looked at this man, at his honest face and his still hands and the straightforward courage it had taken to say all of that without artifice, and she felt the thing she had been feeling for months arrive at a clarity she could no longer mistake or redirect. "I would allow it," she said, and then, because the moment seemed to call for more honesty than she generally deployed, she added, "I have been waiting for you to say something for longer than I would like to admit." The smile that crossed his face when she said that was the best version of his smile, the one that reached all the way up to his eyes, and she thought this was a thing she would not mind seeing for a very long time. Courting in Caldera Springs in 1882 had its own particular form, which was less formal than it might have been in an eastern city, but was not without its customs. And people noticed and had opinions, and Marta Foss told Birdie approximately 3 times in the first 2 weeks that she had known this was coming. And Birdie bore this with the good humor of a woman who is too happy to be particularly annoyed. They rode out together on Sunday afternoons, when the week's work had a natural pause, and they explored the country around Caldera Springs with the pleasure of people who loved land and who could share this love without competition. Graham knew things about the geology of the Panhandle from his time in the territory, and Birdie knew the specific local geography of the basin in a detail that came from 3 years of living in it closely, and they exchanged what they knew in the way people do when sharing knowledge is also a form of intimacy. He kissed her for the first time in late September, on a Sunday afternoon when they had ridden out to the Caprock Escarpment east of town, and sat on the flat stone at the edge with the whole of the basin spread below them. They had been sitting close in the way they had begun to sit, with the kind of closeness that is no longer accidental, and something had shifted in the quality of the silence, and he had turned to her, and she had turned to him at the same moment, and the kiss was brief and careful, and entirely what she had wanted. She looked at him afterwards, and he was looking at her with that expression, the one of plain wanting that held in it also a kind of tenderness she had not expected, and she said, "I was beginning to wonder how much longer that was going to take." "I wanted to be sure," he said. "Sure of what?" "That you wanted it as much as I did. And are you sure now?" "Yes," he said, and kissed her again, less briefly this time. October came in with gold and pale blue, the colors the Panhandle wore in its most generous seasons, and the relationship between Birdie Ellsworth and Graham Dalton deepened in the way that things deepen when the foundation is sound, not with drama but with substance, with the daily additions of shared life and growing knowledge of each other. He met Sadie the milk cow formally, and Sadie regarded him with the profound suspicion she directed at most people, and Graham took this assessment calmly and over several visits won her over with patient consistency, which Birdie observed and found deeply telling about his character. She met Ellis Dalton in the form of letters from New Mexico, and Graham read her portions of them, and his brother was funny and affectionate, and clearly adored Graham in the particular way younger siblings adore an older one who has been both guide and companion. And the glimpse into his family through these letters gave her a fuller picture of who he was before the man she knew. She wrote to her cousin in Kansas and told her about Graham in measured terms that her cousin, who was perceptive, immediately read as more than measured, and her cousin wrote back with a warmth and delight that Birdie found embarrassing in the best way. The days had a quality she had not felt in years, a quality she might have once described as happiness, but which she was now recognizing as something more specific than that. The particular happiness of being in the right place with the right person, of having the thing you had not let yourself know you wanted turn out to be exactly what it appeared to be. But October also brought Holt Digby back. He came on a Tuesday evening when the light was going down, and he came not to make an offer this time but to ask a question, which was worse in some ways because it was harder to refuse. He had heard, he said, that she was friendly with Graham Dalton, and he had heard that Graham Dalton was considering expanding his grazing access on the eastern slope, and what Digby wanted to know, in his pleasant, unhurried way, was whether Birdie had considered combining her 40 acres with Graham's 35 and selling the whole of it to Digby's operation, which was growing, and which could use the eastern basin access, and which would pay a good price for the combined parcel. Birdie stood in her doorway and listened and felt the same cold steadiness settle over her as always with Digby, and then she said something she had not planned to say, which was, "Mr. Digby, I am going to tell you something I have told you in different forms over the course of 2 years, and I will tell you as clearly as I know how so that we don't have to keep repeating this conversation. I'm not selling this land. Not to you, not to anyone. Mr. Dalton makes his own decisions about his own land, and I do not speak for him, but I can tell you that my 40 acres are not for sale at any price and are not part of any negotiation. I would be grateful if you would factor this into your plans going forward." Digby was quiet for a moment, and the pleasant expression shifted enough to reveal something underneath it that was not pleasant at all, and then it settled back into pleasantness, and he said he appreciated her directness and he tipped his hat and he left. She told Graham about it that evening, riding over to where he was finishing up his final outdoor work before dark. He listened, and when she was done his expression was careful. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am entirely all right," she said. "I am simply tired of that man. I'll speak to him if you'd like," he said, not with aggression but with the simple statement of availability. "I would prefer to fight my own battles," she said. "I know," he said. "I know you prefer that and I respect it. I was not offering to fight it for you, just asking if you wanted company." She was quiet for a moment, and then she smiled, and it was the smile she had come to reserve for the moments when he said something that demonstrated how well he understood her, which was a different smile from her others, softer and with more behind it. "I don't need company for this particular battle," she said, "but I appreciate the offer." "It stands," he said, "whenever you do want it." Digby did not come back after that, at least not that autumn, and Birdie suspected that her directness had finally accomplished what 2 years of polite refusals had not. Sometimes the clearest thing was the most efficient thing. November arrived, and the temperature dropped with the seriousness of a country that believed in its winters, and the town began its preparations for the cold months with the efficiency of people who had done this before and did not underestimate what was required. Birdie put up her root vegetables and checked her wood supply and made sure her roof was sound. And all of this felt different this year, because Graham was nearby in a way that changed the quality of the solitude, not removing it but altering it, giving it a different character, the character of chosen alone time rather than imposed aloneness. They had a long conversation one November evening, sitting by the stove in her front room, about the future, about what they were building individually, and what they might be building together if they were honest about the direction of things. And it was one of those conversations that feels like the most important kind, because it is not performance but genuine exchange. two people feeling out the real shape of what they want. "I have thought about this land for a long time," she told him, and the fire was warm and the dark outside was deep and full, and the room felt like a held breath. "About what it would be 5 years from now, 10. I used to think about it with just myself in it because that was the version I was working with. Now I find I'm thinking about it differently." He was watching her, and his expression was what it always was when she spoke this plainly to him, utterly present. "How are you thinking about it?" he asked. "I am thinking about it as something that could grow," she said. "Not just in acreage, in what it holds." "A family," he said simply. "Eventually," she said, "if that's what becomes." "I want children," he said with the same simplicity. "I want a home. I want to build something that means something past my own years. I want that with you if you want it with me. I'm not saying that to rush anything or to push towards something before it's time. I am saying it because I believe in being clear about things." She looked at him for a long moment. The fire snapped. "I want it too," she said. "I want it with you. I'm not ready to say that to many people yet, but I am saying it to you." He reached across the small distance between them and took her hand and held it, and that was all, and it was enough, and maybe it was everything. December came, and with it came the anniversary of things Birdie did not speak about but carried. The anniversary of her father's death and the beginning of the long winter's worst period. The months that had sealed something in her she had believed sealed forever. She carried these things the way she always had, quietly, but this December had a different quality because of what else was in it. The evening of the anniversary of Clement Ellsworth's death was a Sunday, and Graham had known the date from something she had mentioned in passing months earlier, which she had not expected him to remember and which he had, and he came by in the late afternoon with nothing particular, no ceremony, just himself, riding up on Cobalt in the cold, clear air with his coat collar turned up and his breath making small clouds. "I thought you might want company tonight," he said. "I might," she said. They ate dinner together, the simple dinner she had made, and they sat by the fire after, and they talked about Clement. And this time when she talked about her father it was with more ease than before, the ease of grief that has been witnessed and therefore does not need to bear itself alone. She told Graham about the long winter. She told him the parts she had not told anyone, about the cold and the frozen ground, and standing at her father's grave, and the tears that had pressed and refused to fall, and the part of herself she had lost access to after that. She told him that she had not cried in front of anyone since that winter, not once, not in 3 years, and that she had come to believe this was simply the shape of who she was now. She said this matter-of-factly, as a statement of record, and she was not expecting what happened next. What happened was that something gave way in her, quietly and without announcement, some structural thing that had been holding under the weight of all those unshed years, and the tears came up and came over, and she was crying before she had processed that she was crying, real tears, the kind that come from somewhere below the place words live. She tried to stop. She tried to hold it back with the old familiar discipline, and she could not. And that inability itself undid her further. The surprise of it, the sense that something she had managed so long and so completely was now simply happening without her consent. And she sat in her chair by the fire and cried in front of Graham Dalton, in the way she had not cried in front of anyone since the long winter. He did not panic, and he did not attempt to stop her, and he did not say things that were meant to make it easier, because making it easier was not actually what she needed. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded cloth, a clean one, and he held it out to her with the simple practicality of a man who understands what it means to need something clean in a moment of being undone. "Take all the time you need," he said. That was all, just that. Take all the time you need. She took the cloth. She let herself cry, fully and without the old careful management, the way she had not cried since that frozen winter, and it was not graceful and it was not brief, and when it was over she felt scraped clean in the way of things that have been properly tended to at last. When she raised her face he was still there, right where he had been, unhurried and present, and his expression held something that was not pity but was instead a kind of gentle regard, the look of someone who has been trusted with the most private version of a person and who takes that trust as the serious thing it is. "I have not done that in 3 years," she said, her voice still rough with it. "I know," he said. "It has been a long time in coming," she said. "I think so," he said quietly. She looked at the cloth in her hands, the plain, clean, practical cloth that had been the kindest thing anyone had offered her in longer than she wanted to count, and she thought about the kind of person who carries a clean cloth and offers it without making anything of it, without requiring anything in return, and she thought about how entirely she loved this man. "Graham," she said. "Birdie," he said back. "I love you," she said. It came out of her without the cautious management she would have applied even 3 hours ago, as natural and undressed as the tears had been, as honest as the land they were both trying to hold. He was across the small space between them in the next moment, sitting beside her on the bench, and he took her hands in his and looked at her face with those deep, quiet eyes, and he said, "I have loved you since June, I think. Since you stood at that well and told me about your father, and I could hear how much you loved him underneath every word, and I thought, this is a woman who knows how to love things that deserve it, and I would like very much to be one of those things." She laughed at this last part, wet-eyed and real, and then he was laughing too, and they were sitting together in the firelight with her hands in his and the cold outside making the darkness thick and insistent, and the whole plain reaching away in every direction under the winter stars, and it was the most inside Birdie Ellsworth had felt in 3 years. He proposed to her in January, which was 1883 by then, and he did it with full formality, with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother which his mother had sent west with Ellis Dalton on his first visit, which arrived in Caldera Springs in the 3rd week of January, with a traveling merchant who knew the Dalton family and owed Graham a favor. The ring was a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone set in it, and when Graham told her that his grandmother had been a woman of extraordinary practicality and humor, who had ranched 30 years in New Mexico with a husband who mostly tried to keep up with her, Birdie said this was the finest recommendation a ring could have. He got down on one knee in the front room of his own cabin this time, which was solid and warm now after his months of building, and he proposed with the same plain directness he brought to everything, telling her that he wanted to marry her and build with her and grow old on this land with her, and that he could not imagine a better life than one spent alongside her. She said yes before he had quite finished the last sentence. They were married in March of 1883, in the early spring, with the town's minister officiating in the open air between Birdie's homestead and Graham's, because both pieces of land were theirs and neither was more significant than the other, and Marta Foss cried openly and without apology, and Ellis Dalton had come down from New Mexico for it, and proved to be exactly as funny as his letters had suggested. And Birdie's cousin from Kansas had made the journey and stood next to her, and held her hand before the ceremony in the way of women who have been each other's witnesses through everything. The service was simple and honest, like the two people standing in it, with words that meant what they said and promises that both of them had already been keeping in all the ways that mattered. When the minister pronounced them married, and Graham kissed his wife with a thoroughness that made Ellis Dalton whistle and made Marta Foss cry harder, the plains around them were green with the first genuine spring growth, and the sky was the particular blue of a Texas morning that is good from edge to edge. And Birdie Ellsworth, who was now Birdie Dalton in name, although she had already been Birdie Dalton in everything that counted for some months, felt the last of the long winter's residue dissolve in the warmth of the specific spring she was standing in. They combined the homesteads formally, with the paperwork filed in the county seat, and the merged property of 75 acres was not grand by the standards of the larger ranching operations, but it was theirs completely, without debt, without liability, solid in the earth the way things are solid when they have been paid for honestly. The first year of their marriage had the quality of something Birdie had not let herself expect, which was ease. Not the ease of nothing being difficult, because plenty was difficult, the work of 2 properties and the management of livestock and the ordinary catastrophes of frontier life, but the ease of not being alone in it, the ease of there being another person who shared your stakes and your values, and who could make you laugh on the days when the land was hard. Holt Digby made one final approach, in the summer of 1883, and what was different this time was that Graham was standing beside Birdie when Digby rode up, not as a shield but as a presence, and Birdie delivered her refusal with the same clear finality she always had, and Graham said nothing, simply stood there, and the combination of her absolute certainty and his quiet solidity seemed to communicate something that previous conversations had not. Because Digby left and did not come back, they did not celebrate this departure exactly, but they acknowledged it quietly, and there was something in the acknowledgement that was the closing of a long chapter. The autumn of 1883 brought the news that Birdie was expecting, and Graham received this news with a joy that was so complete and so unhidden that it moved her in a way she had not expected, because she had been so accustomed to managing her own emotions that watching someone else be entirely unguarded with theirs was still a somewhat new experience. He took her hands and held them and said, "Birdie," and his voice had the same quality it had the night she had told him she loved him, the quality of something arriving at its place, and she thought that she would spend a good portion of the rest of her life trying to be worthy of being looked at the way Graham Dalton looked at her. Their son was born in late May of 1884, at the end of a spring that had been warm and lush by Panhandle standards, and he arrived with the kind of determined, vocal opinion that suggested he had inherited something of his mother's character. They named him Clement, which was not a surprise to anyone who knew Birdie's history, and Clement Graham Dalton was placed in his mother's arms in the bedroom of the homestead she had fought for and held, and Birdie looked at his small face and felt something that was not like any other feeling she had ever had, enormous and specific and entirely without the armor she usually wore around tender things. Graham sat beside her on the edge of the bed, and he looked at his son and then at his wife, and what was on his face in that moment was the full sum of everything he had ever wanted arriving at once, and he said nothing, because nothing needed to be said, and the 3 of them existed together in that particular silence for a long while. Marta Foss visited the next day with enough food to sustain a small army, and held baby Clement with the competence of a woman, who has been the practical center of a town for decades and loves children with a fierceness that her reserved manner usually obscures. Ellis Dalton wrote a letter from New Mexico that made Birdie laugh out loud, and then cry a little in the happy way she had grown accustomed to since the night in December with the clean cloth, and she wrote back a letter that was twice as long as her letters usually were. Clement grew in the way that babies grow when they are loved, which is entirely and with astonishing speed, and the homestead that had been a woman alone against the land became something else, a living thing with voices in it and boots on its porch and the sound of laughter that was new and old at the same time. The years that followed were full. Not easy, the Panhandle remained itself, uncompromising and enormous and indifferent to human plans, but full in the way that lives are full when they have been built on something real. There were good years for the cattle and there were poor years for the cattle. There were winters that tested everything and springs that made the testing seem worth it. There was the ordinary accumulation of a life shared, the arguments that are also a form of intimacy when conducted between 2 people who trust each other, the reconciliations that follow them, the 1,000 small decisions that compose the shape of a shared existence. Graham built a proper house in the 2nd year of their marriage, replacing the cabin he had put up in his first season, with more rooms than 2 people strictly needed, because he was a man who thought in the future tense and believed in space for what was coming. The house was not fancy, but it was sound, with a wide porch that caught the evening light and from which you could see the full spread of the basin if you stood at the right angle, the distant caprock, the flat, enormous sky, the grass moving in the perpetual wind. They sat on that porch in the evenings through all the years, and the porch held different versions of them over time, the newlyweds and the new parents and the settled couple, and eventually the people who had been through enough together that the silence between them was as rich as the talking. Little Clement Dalton was 3 when his sister arrived, a girl they named Margaret after Graham's grandmother, the practical rancher from New Mexico. And Margaret Dalton came into the world with a calm that was slightly disconcerting, and which she maintained as a fixed character trait through all her early years. An observer, a thinker, with her father's deep eyes and her mother's way of saying a great deal with very few words. Clement, for his part, was none of those things, being loud and curious and enthusiastic about everything in the way of first children who have been loved without reservation. And the relationship between the 2 siblings was from the beginning a study in complementary opposition, each filling in what the other left open. Birdie watched her children grow in the house she had refused to give up, in the land she had held against pressure and time and financial emergency, and the quiet relentlessness of men who believed that what they wanted was inevitably what they would get. And she felt a pride that was not arrogance but was something more like rightness, the feeling of a thing being exactly as it should be. She also watched Graham Dalton be a father, and this was one of the great continuous pleasures of her life, because he brought to fatherhood exactly what she should have expected from a man who brought the same quality to everything he did, which was full attention and deep patience, and the specific kind of love that is not merely feeling but also action, the daily choosing of it. He taught Clement to read before the boy was school age, sitting with him in the evenings by the lamp with a patience that Birdie found deeply affecting, and he taught Margaret to identify the geological formations visible from the caprock on their Sunday rides, and he knew which things each child needed and gave those things in the specific form they required, which is not a small skill, and which is the thing that separates a present parent from a merely available one. In the summer of 1887, Birdie's cousin from Kansas came to visit for 3 weeks, the first extended visit since the wedding, and she arrived with her own husband and 2 children, and the whole property filled up with a density of life and noise and laughter that it had never quite achieved before. And Birdie moved through it all with a happiness she recognized clearly and without embarrassment. One evening of that visit, she and her cousin sat on the porch after the children had been put to bed, and their husbands were inside talking about something, and her cousin looked at her for a long moment and said, "You are entirely different from the Birdie I knew before the long winter." Birdie thought about this. "I'm the same in most ways," she said. "You're softer," her cousin said. "Not weaker, softer. There's a difference. It suits you." Birdie thought about a night in December 4 years prior and a clean cloth and a voice saying, "Take all the time you need," and she thought about what had changed in her since that night and what had opened that had previously been sealed, and she thought about the specific mercy of being known by someone and found worth knowing. "It suits me," she agreed. Her cousin reached over and squeezed her hand, and they sat together in the Texas evening, 2 women who had been each other's witness through distance and loss and new beginnings, and the stars came out in their abundance overhead, the same stars that had always been there, and from inside the house came the sound of the 2 men's voices and the occasional sound of her children moving in their sleep, and the land spread out in every direction in the dark, her land, theirs, the land she had kept. The winter of 1887 was cold, but not the long winter's particular cruelty, and the family spent it as they spent all winters, in the rhythm of the work that cold months require, and Graham read to the children in the evenings, and Birdie kept her accounts and baked the bread that had been poor once from Marta's gritty flour and was now excellent, and Clement the younger was fascinated by his father's maps of the property and had opinions about the fence lines. and Margaret made detailed drawings of things she observed in the world with a seriousness that was both amusing and impressive. It was a good winter. It was a full winter. It was a winter in which the long winter's ghost, if it had ever truly haunted these rooms, was absent, replaced by something warmer and more permanent. In 1888, they hired a hand named Pedro Vasquez, a young man from the Southern Territory who was skilled with horses and cattle and who needed work. And Graham hired him without the particular reluctance that some of the other ranchers in the area expressed about hiring Mexican hands, because Graham Dalton was a man who cared about competence and character and found the other calculations tedious. Pedro Vasquez proved to be excellent at his work and quietly personable, and he stayed for 3 years before moving on to a ranch near San Antonio. And when he left, both Birdie and Graham wished him well with genuine warmth and pressed a letter of recommendation into his hands that was both true and fulsome. This was the kind of people they were, and Caldera Springs knew it, and the town's regard for them was of the specific kind that is earned through consistent behavior rather than declared through self-promotion, which is the only kind of regard worth having. Marta Foss retired the general store in 1889, selling it to a young couple named the Garcias, and she spent her days after that in the particular freedom of a woman who has worked hard all her life and has finally allowed herself to stop. And Birdie visited her every week without fail and brought her things from the kitchen and heard about the town's gossip and sometimes brought Clement and Margaret, who had been fond of old Marta from the beginning in the way that children are sometimes fond of people who love them matter-of-factly, without the performance of affection. Marta died in the autumn of 1890, peacefully, in her own bed, having made her arrangements with the same practical competence she had brought to the running of the store, and her passing made a particular kind of space in Birdie's world that could not be filled by anyone else, because Marta had been one of the first kindnesses of Caldera Springs, and had given Birdie 3 years of steady, discreet, never-demanding friendship through the years when she had needed it most. Birdie cried at the funeral, and Graham was beside her and did not do anything except be beside her, which was exactly right. And afterwards he held her hand on the walk back and said only what there was to say, which was that Marta had been one of the best people in the county, and the town was lesser for her absence. And both of these things were simply and purely true. The 1890s arrived, and with them the changes that were coming for the whole territory, the increasing consolidation of land, the encroachment of barbed wire, and the range wars that the wire sometimes sparked, the gradual domestication of the wildness that had defined the Panhandle for the previous 2 decades. Caldera Springs grew in certain ways and contracted in others, gained a school and a post office and a proper doctor, lost several of its original settlers to age or opportunity, or the restlessness that the frontier country bred in people who could not or did not settle. Birdie and Graham's 75 acres remained what it was, a working homestead that was not large by the standards of the consolidating operations, but was honest and self-sufficient, and loved with a consistency that showed in the quality of everything on it, from the fence lines to the livestock to the house itself. Clement Dalton, at 10 years old, was already his mother's creature in the most essential ways, with her stubbornness and her capacity for work, and her absolute clarity about what she would and would not accept from the world. And he was his father's creature in his patience, and his attentiveness, and the quality of his listening. And the combination made him formidable in the specific way of children who have been well loved by 2 people of genuine character. Margaret Dalton at 7 was still her calm, observant self, drawing things and naming geological formations on Sunday rides and asking questions that had a precision to them that suggested she would be someone who expected the world to make sense and would be quietly relentless about it when it didn't. In the spring of 1891, Birdie discovered she was expecting again, and at 33 years old she felt this news with a different quality than she had at 26, a deeper gratitude for it, an awareness of the gift of it, and she told Graham on the porch one evening in the long light of a May sunset, and he held her face in his hands and said, "Birdie." In that way he had that meant many things at once, and she said, "I know." And they stayed like that in the May light while the basin spread away around them, and the stars prepared their nightly arrival. Their second son was born in November of 1891, and they named him August, for no reason other than that it had a sound to it that pleased them both. And August Dalton arrived in the world with his father's brown eyes and his grandmother Clement's complete certainty about his own opinions. And the house that had first held one and then two and then four was now five, and full, and loud, and entirely itself. The years after that settled into the shape of a life that is complete, not finished or without movement, but complete in the sense of having its true form. And Birdie Ellsworth Dalton lived inside that shape with a gratitude she did not always articulate, but which was present in everything. In the way she walked her land in the early mornings before the rest of the house woke, in the way she sat with her accounts, and knew that every figure in them was something she had fought for and held, in the way she watched Graham with their children, and felt the specific happiness of seeing someone you love be exactly who they are. There was an evening in the mid-1890s, she was perhaps 36 or 37 by then, when she was sitting on the porch alone with Graham after the children had gone to bed, and the night was warm, and the stars were out in the particular density they achieved in that open country, and she was thinking about the winter of 1880, about her father and the frozen ground and the tears that had not come, and about the December evening a decade later when they finally had, and about the cloth Graham had offered her and the 7 words he had said. "Do you remember the night I cried?" she asked him. He didn't ask which night, he knew. "Yes," he said. "I was so surprised," she said. "I had convinced myself I didn't have that anymore, that part of me." "I know," he said. "You weren't surprised," she said. "You just handed me the cloth." "You needed the cloth," he said simply. "And you needed someone not to make a thing of it. The crying wasn't the remarkable part. The remarkable part was that you'd kept it in for 3 years. She was quiet for a moment. "How did you know that?" He was quiet in turn, looking at the stars, and then he said, "Because I knew you. By that point, I knew you pretty well. And I knew that you were carrying a weight that was heavier than it looked from the outside, and I knew that the carrying of it had cost you. I didn't know all of it, the long winter and what happened in it. You told me that later, but I knew enough." She leaned against his shoulder the way she did in the evenings, and he put his arm around her, the way he did when she did, and the plain around them was dark and enormous and theirs, and the house behind them held 3 sleeping children and 20-some years of life lived together, and the night had the quality of a thing that is exactly what it should be. 7 words, she said. "Take all the time you need." 7 words, he agreed. They were the right 7 words. "I'm glad," he said. She turned her face up and kissed him, and he kissed her back with the ease of people who have been kissing each other for a long time and have never tired of it. And then they sat together a while longer in the spring night, until the warmth of it was too good to leave. And eventually they did go inside, and the house received them as houses do when they have been lived in and loved in for a long time, with a quality of welcome that is not about the structure, but about what has accumulated in the walls and floors. All the mornings and evenings and crises and celebrations and ordinary meals and ordinary silences and extraordinary moments that have made a place into a home. Caldera Springs grew around them through the 1890s and into the new decade, changing its shape the way towns change, gaining and losing things, cycling through generations of people who came through with their particular needs and histories and went on or stayed. And the Dalton homestead sat in the basin as it had always sat, unhurried and permanent, with its porch facing west and its fence lines running clean, and its lamp visible in the evening from the road as a fixed point. The kind of fixed point that travelers find reassuring and neighbors find comforting. Clement Dalton, at 16, had his father's hands and his mother's eyes, and a talent for horses that exceeded both of them. And he worked the property with an investment in it that was not obligation but love, the inherited love of land that had come to him through his mother's blood and his mother's stories, and the simple fact of growing up in a place that had been fought for. Margaret at 13 was already the questioner Birdie had always suspected she would be, with notebooks full of her observations and drawings, and a particular interest in the botany of the Panhandle that she pursued with the systematic thoroughness of her father and the absolute stubbornness of her mother. And there was talk of a school in Amarillo that taught such subjects, and the conversation about it in the family was serious and considered. Because both Graham and Birdie believed in the future, their children were going to inhabit and believed in preparing them honestly for it. August at 9 was the household's comedian, which was a role he had apparently chosen for himself at approximately age 3 and had never reconsidered. And his laugh was enormous for his size, and his delight in the world was so genuine and so thoroughly deployed that it could shift the temperature of a room within about 40 seconds of his arrival in it. This was the family that had grown from the 40 acres Birdie had refused to sell, and the man who had ridden in on a gray horse in April 1882 and steadied her on the boardwalk step, and said the right thing and then kept saying the right thing until she had believed him, believed in him, believed through him, in the possibility of something she had buried under the long winter's ice and not expected to recover. On a Sunday in May of 1899, which was a soft and generous day with the early grass green, and the sky the particular attentive blue it wore in its best moods, the Dalton family rode out to the Caprock together, all 5 of them, which was a thing they did once or twice a year, the full family ride. They sat on the flat stone at the edge of the escarpment and looked out over the basin, the whole of their world laid out below them, and it was late afternoon, and the light was the long golden light that makes everything it touches look like it has always been there and always will be. Birdie sat between Graham and August, with Clement and Margaret on Graham's other side, and Graham's arm was around her shoulders, and August was leaning against her in the comfortable way he always did, warm and solid and smelling of horse and grass, and Clement was pointing out something to Margaret about the fence lines visible below, and Margaret was correcting his estimate of the distance with the patient certainty she brought to all corrections. Birdie looked at the land. 40 acres of it had been her father's dream and her inheritance, and the thing she had held against 2 hard years of pressure, and $63 more worth of it had been the crisis that had brought her to the table with the man beside her. And all of it together was the place where she had buried the long winter and found her way back to tears, and learned again what it was to be soft in the right places and solid in the others. The sun went down in the west in the full production of color that the Panhandle offered to those who stayed long enough to watch, orange and rose and the deep burning amber that was specific to that sky in that country, and the family sat in it together, unhurried, and the hawks made their last circles of the day overhead, and the wind moved through the grass below them with a sound like the land breathing. "All right," Graham said to her quietly. "All right," she said. She had been all right for a long time now, and she would be all right for all the time that came after, and she knew this not with the cold certainty she had once used to brace herself against the world, but with a warm and deeply rooted knowing, the knowing of someone who has come through something and come out on the right side of it, holding the hand of the person who had helped her find the door. The stars came out slowly, one by one and then in their multitudes, and the family stayed until it was fully dark, because there was nowhere else to be and no reason to hurry, and the night was warm and the land was theirs and everything that mattered was right there on that stone, breathing together in the Texas dark, having made the life they had made, having held the things worth holding. Birdie Ellsworth Dalton, who had not cried in front of anyone for 3 years and who had cried in front of one person in a way that had opened everything, looked at the stars her father had once loved and felt him present in them, in the land below, and the children beside her, and the enduring rightness of the choice to stay and hold on and let someone in. She was grateful for all of it, for the hardness that had made her, for the softness she had recovered, for the man who had handed her a cloth without ceremony and said 7 words that had been worth more than 7,000. Take all the time you need. She had taken it, and it had been enough, and it had been everything.